Hi you guys, welcome to the video. I'm John Villegas-Grubbs. This video is, in fact I think this whole string of videos is going to be a lot of fun. This intro video is where I tell you the story of how the book came about. It's a book that I wrote quite a few years ago, back in 2010 I think is when we printed it. It was printed but never published. But here's the story behind it. Back in the 80s, I lived in Albuquerque with my sister Claudia and her husband Tim and their two girls. Carrie, I think, was around the age of 5 or 6, and Christy was a couple years behind her. And when I lived there, I babysat them quite a bit. It was a lot of fun. I loved it. And this book this story comes from that time. I remember when I used to babysit them, the younger of the two, Christy, whose nickname was Critter, she and I used to crack each other up. We would make each other laugh anytime we spoke in an accent. There was one time in particular where I remember this, I'll always remember it. We were watching TV, and at that time there was a cartoon that was real popular that was a shark who spoke with a German accent, and he was not very bright, and he had an assistant who was a tuna fish who was very, very smart. And every time the tuna fish came up with an idea, a good idea, the shark would claim it as his own. And the tuna fish assistant, his name was Pally. And there was one time in particular that we were watching TV, and at the end of the cartoons, we were watching the German shark cartoon, and at the end of it, I said to the girls, girls, I think it's time we get some cookies and milk. And the younger of the two, Christy, answered me back, "That's right, Pally, that's a great idea, what I already thought of," which was what the tuna fish used to say. In fact, she said that to me so many times, "That's right, Pally," that it became my nickname. And at that time I worked in a boots and saddles retail outlet, blocking hats and selling boots. And she came into the store and she couldn't have been more than 5. And she was asking all the other employees, "Where's my Pally? Where's my Pally?" And they didn't know who she was talking about. And then she saw me and she goes, "There's my Pally." So they started calling me Pally. That's how I got the nickname. Anyway, anytime Christy and I would talk to each other in accents, we would just crack each other up. Well, Carrie and Christy usually wouldn't go to bed unless I gave them a story. And I read all of the stories in all of the books that they had. So the only way I could continue doing this was to make up a bunch of characters, and then the story at bedtime would be just me telling them what they did that day. It was easier than trying to find more books and more stories. The stories evolved about animals, and many of the animals had accents, because I knew how much Carrie and Christy loved accents. Well, fast forward a few years, Carrie and Christy are grown up, married, they're having children, and Christy said to me, "John, you really ought to write those stories down that you used to tell us when we were kids." And at first I wasn't interested in it. I didn't want to try to tackle it. And eventually Christy said, "If you don't write those stories down, our children are going to be too old for them." So she kind of pushed me into writing the stories. And I did, and I put them in this book. So that's the story behind the story. The book is called Kitninny, Katniss, New Dog in the Neighborhood. Now, when we printed the book, I reached out to a very, very talented lady named Becky Bohannon, and she did the illustrations. I contracted with her to do the illustrations of all the characters in the chapter. So these videos are going to be this book. Now here's the problem that I encountered after I wrote it, and it's not a simple, it's 160, 170, 80 pages long. I wrote all the characters that have accents so that the writing of the book was in phonetics, so that the person reading the book could tell that they were actually speaking with an accent. Once it was printed, and I read it, and you can see that the printing of it, it has all of the panels that Becky did, the illustrations that Becky did, and they're wonderful. They're wonderful, and they'll be in the videos. I'll put them in the videos in the PDF format. When I was reading the book, it occurred to me that it's too hard to read. The phonetic writing of the words that the animals said was just too difficult to read. It was tedious, and the book was never published. Well, for years after that, every once in a while I'd come back to the book and think, I really got to do something with that. I talked to Christy, who's an actress. She got her degree in theater. Wouldn't it be fun if she and I read the book together and acted the accents? And we talked about that from time to time. Nothing came of it. So now I've decided that now that I'm retired and I have a lot of time, I'm going to read the book on video so that I can read the accents. So this video is the introduction. I'm going to read the introduction to the book, and then the next video will be where I start with chapter 1. This is the foreword and the introduction. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about a character called Rogelio. Rogelio is an alligator. No, I'm sorry, not an alligator. He's a iguana. I had the whole book finished, and I went on vacation to Costa Rica, and there were iguanas everywhere. I mean, big iguanas, 6-foot iguanas. And at the time, I decided I need to put a character in the book that's an iguana. So I did. His name is Rogelio, and I had to rewrite this whole second half of the book to put Rogelio in. There's one other thing that I want to comment about the book. We have a very dear friend, he's no longer with us, but he's a very dear friend named Jeffrey Wood, who was a published Christian writer. And when he was published by big publishing houses, Doubleday, I think, I talked to him about the book, and he said, no talking animals. He basically said, don't try to get it published with a big publishing house, John. The word on the street is no talking animals. So these are videos about a book with talking animals. And I'm going to read the foreword and the introduction, and the next video will be the beginning of chapter 1. Foreword. You don't wake up and find yourself over 50 years old and decide that you're going to launch a children's story, even one that you've been talking about for well over 20 years, unless some wonderful folks are in your proximity. There are so many people who have listened to me tell sections of this story over the years, but I want to focus on the last 4 years when it changed from an anecdote to a project. I have to mention John, who was around when I first told the stories to my nieces and who lost a big sale because I was doing Wolfgang and his customers were German and thought I was making fun of them. I don't think anyone has heard the characters as many times as he. One time, some 17 years later, I was reading a passage to him on the phone and he still laughed. I need to thank Ida, who usually lights up a room, but whose smile sparkled when she first heard the story from me. And my friend, her husband Mike, for not making me feel silly about doing a children's book, because I know Mike and I bet he wanted to. My sister and close friend Chris, for the change in her expression when sitting in my living room she heard the music to chapter 1, my first bit of instrumentation. That was a composition. I was watching her. It was when the xylophone came in. I can only hope that I have never lose that memory. Her expression captured everything I have ever hoped for, and for her laughter, as I did Rogelio at the dining room table. I need also to thank my sister Connie. We sat on the deck in Taos, and she jumped right in with support and a true and sincere interest, lifting my hopes. In Big Lake, Texas, she laughed when I was quoting Rogelio, "I can't wait to read it." And I knew she meant it. My sister Cindy, who changed the name of the series, it was her idea to name it Neighborwood series. We had a different name picked out, and for being the first to ask for more than one copy. Roger, who was always happy to talk about it as though it was possible on the mini drives in Delaware, and who said well done when he heard the first music not knowing how important it was for me to hear that from him. And his wonderful wife, Fran, who told me I should write the story down. Enid, I had to face her as I came into the office because she was waiting for the book and demanded an update. She would not let me relax and postpone it. And I might well have otherwise. Those of you lucky enough to know Enid know what I mean, and for introducing me to Becky. A special thanks go to Sarah and Dave, Becky, Juliana, and Claudia. Sarah brought the book to reality in her designs and her advice. Becky's drawings were perfect, like she had been there or something. She brought the characters into view. Juliana matched Becky's panels to the story and laughed with me, reminding me of the joy of these characters. My sister Claudia worked with a relentless perfection on the editing. This was no walk in the park. And in all, she smiled as if her efforts were nothing. So much talent attributed to this project is theirs. And finally, a very special thanks to Esther Turek-Grubbs Bingman, a very remarkable woman, without whose generosity, independent publishing of this book would not have been considered, and the book might not now be in your hands. To each of you, Kit and the others owe their life. And this is the introduction. Like so many other stories, this one was born when two little children wanted to be entertained. Two little children who would probably believe anything. I have many wonderful nieces and nephews, having come from a very large family, but two in particular were very close to me because I lived with them for a time and babysat them often. They were the daughters of my older sister and her husband, and their names are Carrie and Christy. My niece Christy and I had a special bond that neither we nor anyone could really figure out. It was as if almost what we thought of the world was an inside joke between us. Whenever I spoke to her in accent, which was often, she would begin giggling uncontrollably. Her laugh was disassembling. You could not hear her laugh without laughing yourself. And I would start by speaking an accent, and then she would answer me in the same accent, and we would both end up giggling so much we couldn't talk. Both she and Carrie were voracious consumers of stories and would demand a story at bedtime every time I babysat. I quickly ran out of stories to tell them, so I started making up characters which are now in this book, and little plot lines for them. Once I had created the characters, I could make up any story by just asking myself what might have happened to them since I last babysat the girls, and what would the characters have done in those circumstances. It's almost 30 years later, and my niece Christy now has nieces of her own. 3 little gigglers wanting their own stories. I had never written the stories down, and she advised me that if I did not do so soon, her nieces would be too old for it. So I had to get to work. When I set out to create the characters and put them into the context of a plot, I gave a little thought to what makes a child's view of things so different, what makes them childlike. I thought back to my own childhood. When I was a child of about 4 or 5, my friends and I would always have a bowl of minnows as pets that we had caught in the nearby bayou. They would usually die after a time, and we would go get more. I began to wonder where they came from, and I concluded that they must have come from rain. Where else could they possibly have come from? So rather than catch more minnows in the bayou, the next time it rained, my friends and I got every bucket and pan, every bowl and can, and left them out to be filled with rain. Then we took and placed them all in the garage and waited for the minnows to appear. The fact that they never did appear made us wonder, but it didn't necessarily convince us that they really did not come from rain, but maybe only rain that fell in muddy bottom places. We did not abandon our theory, we only revised it. My father would have great fun telling us things because he knew we would believe him. We always did. After all, he was omniscient. He told us that the trees in Sugar Land, Texas talk. We asked, how is this possible? And he answered, magic. So as we drove through Sugarland on our way to visit my grandmother in Bryan, Texas, we would roll down the windows and shout at the trees as we drove by. I studied logic as an undergraduate and took a degree in philosophy, and I believe that children can believe anything because anything is possible. It is that sweep of possibility that creates wonder and delight in children. If something does not make sense initially, you just play the wild card. Magic. Children are not burdened by the definitive or the associated processes. As we grow up, we become indoctrinated in argument and the structure of thought and begin to comport to it. But it wasn't there to begin with. Innocence is the first casualty of reason. In the vernacular of logic, an argument is, quote, sound if it has two characteristics. Its premises are true, and the argument is valid in that its conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. For children, an argument need only be valid. They do not know that there is anything other than truth. It's all true. So I played with the idea of different animals having different explanations of the world they inhabit as I put one unified plot to the story of characters. Their explanations are like arguments in a mathematical sense, and they are all valid. But as it happens, none of them are sound. I went to Costa Rica, and when I came back, decided to add Rogelio at the last minute. I rewrote 4 chapters, and what a pleasure that was. I have to admit that I think Rogelio is my favorite. Most of the characters are ethnic because I had to have accents, but I meant no generalizations or slurs. I do not mean to suggest that Germans are forgetful or that Boston sophisticates are given to hysteria, any more than that Costa Ricans fear hidden crocodiles that aren't there. To attempt to avoid such possible slant would be to attribute to it a legitimacy it doesn't have. All in all, it was a genuine pleasure to write this story, although the accents were sometimes very hard to set down. I wrote much of it on planes traveling across the country in my real job. I would be sitting on the plane typing away on my laptop, and as a line would occur to me, I would laugh out loud as I typed it out. I am sure the other passengers around me thought I was off balance. But I was laughing because it was pure delight to return to the mindset of a child, wherein trees talk and minnows come from rain. But I hope you join me for chapter 1. Thanks.